The first time I set foot on that island, I was 12, and I thought I was lucky. My name is Emily, but back then it didn't matter who I was. He smiled at me like I was the only person in the world who mattered, and I believed him. His yacht cut through the Caribbean waves like a silver bullet, leaving the shore behind. I stared at the turquoise water and the palm trees swaying gently, trying to ignore the pit in my stomach. The crew called me a guest, and his voice, smooth and soft, promised an adventure. I remember thinking, this is it. This is my new life. My parents were oblivious, distracted, and trusting. Nobody suspected anything. He told me I was special, that I was chosen, and my naive 12-year-old brain swallowed every word like water on a scorching day. We docked, and the island rose like a paradise from the sea. Flowers bloomed, birds sang, and laughter floated in the air. But paradise is a lie. The first night, when I went to bed in the lavish villa, the door clicked shut behind me, and I realized too late that I wasn't just a guest. I was trapped. The wind outside whispered like it knew, and I did too. Something had changed, something dark, and I couldn't yet name it. The mornings were the worst. He would appear, calm and composed, like nothing had happened the night before. I'd sit at the edge of the king-sized bed, knees pressed to my chest, praying that maybe today would be different, but it wasn't. He had a way of smiling at me that made my stomach twist. Not the warm smile of a friend or family. This one cut, precise, rehearsed. "Emily," he said softly, leaning against the doorframe, "you're growing up so fast. Do you know how beautiful you are?" My throat tightened. I wanted to run, hide under the mattress, anywhere, but I couldn't. There was no one to call, no parents, no friends, just the villa, the guards, and him. Days blurred. They called them lessons, and he had schedules, lists, and rules. I learned how to nod, to obey, to smile when he entered the room. Fear became routine, and silence was my shield. I couldn't cry in front of anyone. They told me that would make things worse. Every night, I lay awake, listening to the ocean, wondering how someone could smile and hurt someone else at the same time. That smile, so precise, haunts me still. I see it in shadows, in reflections, in strangers' eyes. It's the first thing that told me paradise wasn't real. I remember the first time I realized innocence could be taken and never returned. I was 13, and he said I was ready. I didn't understand what that meant exactly, but I could feel the fear buzzing under my skin. My body shook in a way I couldn't control. I wanted to scream. I wanted to disappear. "You're special, Emily. Nobody else will understand you like I do," he whispered, brushing my hair behind my ear. His hands lingered, and I froze. Panic clawed through me, but I stayed still. Somewhere deep, my 12-year-old self, a self I barely recognized, tried to fight back, tried to scream no. The island became a cage. The sun, the sand, the waves, everything that should have been freedom felt like chains. I learned quickly. Obedience was safety. Silence was survival. No one ever explained how to make sense of it. I couldn't tell my parents. I couldn't trust anyone. I was alone with a monster wearing a perfect smile. Evenings were worse. After the lessons, I'd sit on the balcony, knees tucked under my chin, staring at the horizon, praying that no one would notice the trembling. My innocence, my childhood, was ripped away in pieces, and I began to understand that paradise could hide horror, and horror could wear a mask. By the time I turned 14, I had memorized every rule of the island, rules nobody taught me, rules I learned by pain. Speak only when spoken to, smile when required, don't look at the guards, don't look at him too long, and most of all, never show fear, because fear made you visible. I became invisible. I moved through the villa like a shadow, whispering to myself just to hear a human voice. There were other girls, younger than me, older than me, trapped in their own cages. Some cried quietly in the night, some learned to laugh to survive. I learned to sit still while the others disappeared behind doors, only to return hours later, changed. One day, I met Leela, a girl of 16, eyes hollowed from too much watching, too much waiting. She whispered, "They take what they want. They never stop. Don't cry." I wanted to scream at her, to tell her it wasn't fair, that the world outside would care, but she had already learned the truth. The world didn't know, and the world didn't care. I began keeping track of the days, marking them with invisible scratches on the walls of my mind. Each day that passed was another loss. My laughter, my childhood, my trust, it was all gone, replaced by shadows and the echo of his smile. Silence became my shield, and fear my only constant companion. Desperation is a teacher. It teaches quickly. At 15, I started noticing the routines, the guards' shifts, the deliveries, the visitors who arrived and left without a trace. I started to memorize the perimeter, the fences, the boats docked at the far end. Every island has a weakness. Every trap has a flaw. I confided in Leela, whispering plans like criminals in the dark. "If we wait for the right night, we can get to the shore," I said. My hands shook with a mix of fear and hope. She nodded, eyes wide. "I'm too scared," she admitted. "I can't." I understood. Fear wasn't weakness, it was survival. But I had to try. I had to believe. I scribbled maps in my mind, traced escape routes under the moonlight, and imagined freedom, even if only for a moment. That hope, fragile and dangerous, became my anchor. It was the only thing that reminded me I was still alive and more than just body. Every whisper, every careful glance at the guards, every stolen moment outside became part of my preparation. I knew that one wrong move could erase everything, my chance, my life, my chance at returning to a world that still believed in childhood and safety. Yet the thought of staying, I couldn't. Sometimes survival isn't just about avoiding danger, it's about knowing who's on your side or who isn't. Leela, my only ally, was gone. One morning, a new girl arrived, scared, small, trembling like I once had. I wanted to warn her, to hold her hand, to whisper that nothing was her fault, but the island had its own rules. One day, Leela didn't show up. Guards said she moved on. Moved on, my heart whispered, as if she'd chosen the month to own her freedom. I hated myself for not stopping it, for not doing more. But fear does that. It teaches you to obey before you can fight. I realized then that trust was a luxury we couldn't afford. Each day, I learned to hide more than my body. I hid my thoughts, my intentions, my hope. The island wasn't just a place, it was a machine, grinding girls into silence. And the thing that haunted me most wasn't the abuse, it was how normal it had become, how easily we learned to obey just to live. In that moment, I promised myself that if I ever left, I would remember everything, every face, every whispered name, every stolen childhood, and I would make sure the world knew what paradise hid behind its perfect mask. The nights on the island were the worst, dark, humid, and heavy with the ocean smell. They made every shadow seem alive. At 16, I knew every creak of the floors, every whisper of wind through the palm trees, but one night I froze in a way I hadn't before. He came into the villa, quietly like he always did, but this time the air carried something different. Power, control, fear that wasn't just mine, it was the fear of everyone on the island. He walked past the girls, his eyes scanning, always scanning. I tried to shrink into the corner, but he always found us. He always did. Leela had warned me before, long ago, that resistance was a luxury. The only way to survive was compliance, silence, invisibility. I obeyed. I nodded, smiled when required, whispered words he wanted, and each time a part of me died a little. My voice became mine only in my mind, my body no longer mine at all. That night, I realized fully how deeply trapped I was, not just physically, but mentally. The island wasn't a place you could leave by climbing fences or jumping into the ocean. It was a place that entered your mind, that made you doubt your own instincts, that convinced you that fear was safety. I lay awake that night, counting each second, each heartbeat, each stolen breath, wondering if I'd ever escape the memory of him. Visitors came and went. They were always smiling, wealthy, powerful, untouchable. They never spoke to us, never looked at our faces. We existed only as shadows, background noise to their amusement. At 17, I started noticing patterns, the way they avoided our eyes, the way they whispered to him in corners, the way the guards nodded and laughed at their jokes. One man stayed longer than usual. He watched silently while we were ordered to perform, his presence heavy and cold. He never touched, but his gaze made me shiver. He was different, calculated, and in that moment, I understood fully we weren't just trapped by the island, we were trapped by the system surrounding him, by the untouchable power that made our suffering invisible. I began memorizing faces, license plates, accents. Every detail mattered because someday, maybe someday, these details could be used against them. It was the only piece of control left, knowledge. That night, I whispered to myself that I would remember, that I would survive, that I would fight back. Not now, not yet, but someday. I held that thought like a fragile ember, hiding it under fear, under silence, under the mask I wore every day. At 18, I heard a rumor from one of the new girls. An old guard had been arrested, someone who had seen too much, spoken too much. It was a whisper, a breath of air through the suffocating walls of the villa. I clung to it. My mind, hardened by years of compliance, started imagining a way out. The perimeter, the patterns, the weaknesses, they were all there if someone was willing to take the risk. But I had learned hope was dangerous. It made you visible. It made you human. Every night I traced escape routes in my head, imagining the boats, the fences, the water, the distant lights of freedom. Leela had long gone. I was alone now, and solitude sharpened everything. I learned to trust only myself, my memory, my instincts. I whispered to the younger girls when they asked, "You'll get out one day." Some believed me, most didn't. I realized that hope wasn't just survival, it was defiance, and defiance could be deadly, but it could also be the only thing keeping me alive inside. By 19, I had mapped everything in my mind, the docks, the schedules, the guards' rotations. Every detail mattered. I carried it like a secret treasure, folding it away under fear and survival. Every whispered instruction, every small act of obedience, every silence was part of a larger strategy I didn't yet know if I could execute. I began observing the visitors closely, noticing which ones were careless, which ones were distracted by their own arrogance. One slip, one wrong step could give me a chance. I memorized every license plate, every yacht name, every time the guards checked the perimeter cameras. It wasn't just about escaping the island anymore. It was about reclaiming myself piece by piece from the years that had been stolen. The nightmares, the forced smiles, the silent screams, they had to end. I whispered to the girls around me, "One day someone will notice. One day someone will listen. Don't give up. Don't let them take your mind too." They looked at me with fear, but also a spark of understanding. Survival wasn't just existing. Survival was planning, calculating, waiting. That night, as I lay on the cold floor of the villa, I imagined the water, the city lights, freedom. My hands trembled, but my heart felt something I hadn't felt in years, control. I wasn't free yet, but I was preparing, and sometimes that felt like everything. 20 years old, and I realized something crucial. I could either be broken or I could break myself free. The years of abuse had left invisible scars, but they had also forged something sharp, something determined inside me. I had learned every rule, every expectation, every manipulation. Now it was time to turn it against them. I started small. A note slipped into a bag, a whispered plea to a visitor who might actually care. I scanned every corner, every shadow, but I had learned to move like a ghost, unnoticed, untraceable. The fear never left, but it became fuel instead of chains. One night, a guard faltered. He underestimated me. That mistake became my opportunity. A distraction, a misstep, a small window of time. It was all I needed. I whispered to myself, "You are not theirs anymore." It wasn't rebellion yet. It wasn't freedom. It was defiance. And in that defiance, I found my first taste of power since arriving. Even in the darkness of the villa, even with the ocean stretching impossibly wide beyond, hope flickered. Hope that one day the years stolen from me would be returned, even if only in memory, even if only in survival. The first real chance came on a night thick with storms. Rain pelted the island like bullets, and the wind howled through the palm trees, masking the sound of my movements. I had watched the guards for weeks, memorized their routines, their small, predictable weaknesses. Tonight, everything aligned. I slipped through the hallways, silent as a shadow, every nerve screaming with adrenaline. My heart pounded so hard I feared it would give me away, but I kept moving. I passed rooms where girls slept, some unaware, some awake with wide eyes, silently begging me to hurry. I reached the docks. A small service boat bobbed in the water, barely noticed by the careless guards. I checked the ropes, the motor, every knot I had memorized in my mind. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the intensity of the moment, the cusp of freedom after years of captivity. As the engine roared to life, I looked back at the island. The villa loomed, ominous and cruel, a place that had taken years of my life, but not my spirit. Tears mingled with the rain on my face. I whispered a vow. I will survive. I will live. I will tell the world. The night swallowed me as the boat carried me away. For the first time in nearly a decade, I could breathe without watching over my shoulder. The dark clouds parted slightly, revealing stars like tiny beacons guiding me towards life, towards a future I had only dared to dream of. I didn't know exactly where I was, only that I was moving away from every nightmare that had imprisoned me. The shoreline felt alien under my bare feet, but the sensation of solid ground, even cold and jagged, was intoxicating. I was alive, really alive. A fisherman spotted me, his eyes wide, suspicious. I lied through trembling lips, saying I had been lost on a yacht. He didn't press much. The storm made explanation unnecessary. He helped me to his truck, and I sat in the back, wet, shaking, heart hammering. I felt a mix of fear and exhilaration, like a bird escaping a cage it didn't realize was gilded. I had no identity now, no place to go, but I had something more important: autonomy. The weight of the island, the control, the terror, it was slipping from my shoulders with every mile I put behind me. That night, in a small motel room, I wrapped myself in a towel, staring at the cracked ceiling. I realized that freedom wasn't safe yet, but it was mine. And for the first time, I dared to imagine a life outside the shadows, a life where my story could be told, where I could be more than what they had made me. The next morning, I sat on the edge of the motel room, wrapped in a thin blanket, trembling not from the cold, but from the reality of what I had to do. I had spent years swallowing my voice, pretending the horrors of that island didn't define me, but now I had to speak. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I had memorized from whispered advice, a hotline for survivors, someone who could listen, someone who could believe. My voice shook at first, barely audible. I need help," I whispered. The operator didn't interrupt. She let me breathe, let me spill every detail I had kept hidden, the names, the routines, the terror. Tears blurred my vision. Words I had buried deep came spilling out, raw, uncontrollable. I talked about the fear that had been my constant companion, the manipulation, the endless nights where I believed the world had abandoned me. Each confession lifted a small piece of the burden from my chest. By the time I hung up, exhaustion had settled into my bones, but also a strange sense of relief. I had told someone. Someone had heard me. For the first time, the nightmares didn't feel like mine alone. And that night, I slept, truly slept, unguarded, as if the shadows had thinned, giving me a glimpse of life reclaimed. I couldn't hide forever. The island, the faces, the manipulation, they haunted me in every reflection, every shadow. But running only allowed them to linger. If I was to heal, I had to confront it. I started journaling, writing the story no one could deny. I described the villa, the endless rooms, the men in suits, the whispered threats. Every word shook me, but I forced them onto paper, refusing to censor even the darkest details. Writing became both shield and sword, painful but liberating. The more I wrote, I realized something crucial. The power wasn't in hiding or forgetting, it was in exposing, in naming the abuse, in reclaiming my narrative from the people who had tried to erase it. I began to connect with other survivors, women whose stories mirrored mine, women who had been swallowed by fear and silence. We shared names, dates, moments that seemed impossible to remember. We were a network of voices long suppressed, now finding strength in numbers. For the first time in decades, I felt a flicker of agency. The island had taken so much, but it would not take my story. I would survive not just in body, but in truth. Months passed, and the legal wheels began to turn. Lawyers, investigators, and psychologists became part of my life, strangers who somehow felt safer than the people I had once trusted. The process was grueling, each detail I shared reopening old wounds, each memory clawing its way back into the present. Court prep was a battlefield of its own. I sat across from a team of attorneys who told me I had to relive every moment, who, what, where, when, and how. My stomach twisted, my hand shook, but I nodded, determined. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about reclaiming the lives that had been stolen, about protecting those who might come after me. Therapy sessions became confessions to a neutral witness, someone who didn't flinch, someone who could hold the weight of my trauma without judgment. And slowly, I started to separate myself from the girl who had been taken, the one who had hidden in corners, afraid of every shadow. I knew that telling the truth in court meant staring into the faces of men who thought power could silence me, but I was no longer silent. Each rehearsal, each recounting, each tear shed became armor. I would not crumble. Not again. Not now. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived, and I walked into the courtroom not as a victim, but as a witness to history. The island, the lies, the manipulation, they would not win. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and tension, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes your palms sweat. I took a deep breath and looked at the faces of the men who had orchestrated my nightmares. Not just the ones on trial, but the shadows behind them, the enablers, the ones who had looked away. I spoke slowly, deliberately, letting every word land. I was 14 when he took me, my voice steady, even though my stomach churned. The flash of cameras, the murmurs in the gallery, they didn't matter. What mattered was the truth. Every detail I had buried for decades now had to rise. Every fear, every stolen moment of childhood, every tear shed in silence. This was their reckoning. The defense tried their usual tactics, questioning my memory, twisting timelines, implying consent where none existed. But I held my ground. I remembered every smell, every creaking floorboard, every face I couldn't forget. My pain was a shield now, not a weapon against me. At one point, I looked over and saw my support system, friends I had trusted, investigators who had believed me, my therapist, even distant family who had stepped up. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of power. The girl who had been silenced on that island was finally speaking, and this time, she would not be ignored. The verdict day arrived like a storm breaking. I remember walking into the courthouse, the sun blinding me through the tall glass windows, and feeling an odd mix of dread and anticipation. Every step echoed in the empty hallways, a reminder of the years I had carried this weight alone. Sitting in the gallery, I gripped my notebook, a journal I had kept for 20 years, every entry a silent witness to my story. It had been my refuge, my proof, my lifeline. Now it was time for it to speak. I glanced at the jury, their faces attentive, unreadable. I couldn't control their judgment, but I could control my truth. The judge called the courtroom to order. The prosecuting attorney's voice was firm, resonant, unwavering, recounting the horrors, the manipulation, the stolen childhoods. And then it was my turn. I stood, heart pounding, knees slightly trembling, and began again. But this time, something had shifted. The terror of the island was still there, yes, but it was overlaid with something else, resolve and a strange, fierce clarity. As the jury filed out to deliberate, I realized the chains I had carried for decades weren't fully gone, but they were loosening. For the first time, I could breathe without guilt, without shame. For the first time, I felt the possibility of healing. The courtroom felt like it had shrunk, every sound amplified, the scratching of pens, the shifting of shoes, the hushed whispers. My hands were clasped tight around my notebook, knuckles white. I had told everything, every detail of the island, every manipulation, every stolen day of my childhood, every tear I had shed, every night I had spent shaking awake. And now, all that waited was their decision. The jury filed back in, faces unreadable, but I could feel the tension in the air like a living thing. The four persons stood, cleared their throat, and began to speak. My chest felt tight, my throat dry, but I forced myself to breathe. We, the jury, find the defendant, the pause stretched unbearably, guilty on all counts. Relief washed over me in a wave so intense I almost stumbled backward. My knees threatened to give out, but I caught myself. Tears blurred my vision as I looked around the courtroom. Some faces I recognized from the past, the investigators, the attorneys, even a few journalists, but it all faded. It didn't matter anymore. The man who had haunted my nightmares, who had stolen my childhood, would finally face the consequences. For the first time, I felt a lightness I hadn't known in decades. I was free. Not just from him, but from the shadow of fear that had followed me all these years. Walking out of the courthouse, sunlight hit my face like a promise. I closed my eyes and inhaled the air, tasted freedom for the first time in decades. The streets bustled around me, people laughing, honking cars, the usual chaos of city life. But it felt different. I was seeing it for the first time, really seeing it. I thought of all the years lost, the childhood stolen, the nights I had spent shaking in fear. But I also thought of the life I still had, the moments I could still claim. My voice might have trembled in court, my body might carry the scars, but my spirit was finally unbroken. I could breathe without looking over my shoulder. I could speak without choking on shame. That evening, I walked to the pier, water stretching endlessly under the fading sun. I let the breeze wrap around me, salt on my lips, and I whispered to the girl I used to be, the one who had been taken too soon. I survived. We survived. And now it's our turn to live. The phone buzzed in my pocket, friends reaching out, people I had kept at a distance, offering support. I smiled, a real smile that reached my eyes, felt it deep in my chest. Life wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. But it was mine, and I was finally ready to take it back, one small, precious moment at a time.